Welcome everyone to the second Responsible Conduct of Research workshop today. This is on authorship and reviewer ethics with our presenter, Dr. Stephen Fliesler. I'm going to run through a few things before we begin. I want to let you all know that there are two other series other than Responsible Conduct of Research running this semester in Dissemination and Implementation Science and in Translational Teamwork. If you're interested in those topics or a wide variety of other topics that we offer, I'm going to put our schedule as well as our YouTube library of videos in the chat for you all. And I also want to let you know, for those who haven't attended the first workshop, that you're eligible for a certificate of completion if you attend all 6 of the sessions in this series. If you're not able to attend one, just email me. I'll put my email in the chat, Elizabeth Bengert, and we can work something out for you. We also offer a micro-credential in responsible research. So if you're interested in that, I will put Catherine Sedota's email in the chat. She's on the call today if you have any questions about that. We offer CME, or continuing medical education credits, for this series. Today, you're eligible to receive 1.5 credits for physicians. And for the entire series, you can earn up to 9 credits. If you have any questions, please either put them in the chat or save them until the end of the presentation, and we'll address them at that time. And I'll also be pasting an evaluation link in the chat, so please fill that out. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Fliesler for a presentation on authorship and reviewer ethics. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Liz, and welcome everybody. So this is the second lecture in this workshop series. I don't have any financial disclosures. We have a lot of ground to cover today, so I'm going to define plagiarism, forms of plagiarism, the scope of problem, both in the US and worldwide. I'm going to go over some famous plagiarism cases, also UB policies pertinent to plagiarism, consequences of plagiarism, some useful tips and tools for detecting, dealing with, and avoiding plagiarism. I'm going to describe the credit cycle, giving credit where credit is due, and then the ICMJE recommendations for contributorship, earned authorship versus acknowledgements. Then author responsibilities and assurances that are given to the journals when you submit publications, duplicate or redundant submission and duplicate publication, and the use of generative AI, its use and misuse, and a brief discussion about the current framework at this university. And then we'll have case discussions like we had last time. And that part is an audience participation part. So we'll be asking you to answer questions that are posed. Okay, there is a lot of literature out there on this topic. The very fact that there are literally dozens and dozens of books on this topic means that it must be a prevalent problem. So according to the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, their recommendations for the conduct of reporting, editing, and publication of scholarly work in medical journals, the fundamental guidelines are given in this freely available publication. And as you can see, it was just updated last month. So I would highly recommend that everybody on this call download a copy of this. It's free. It's a great reference resource for anybody who's going to be submitting manuscripts for publication and also engaging in research in any way. So just to remind people from the last lecture, research misconduct is defined by the Office of Research Integrity of the U.S. federal policy as research fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reviewing research, or in reporting research results. So I'm going to talk about plagiarism. As a general working definition, the Office of Research Integrity considers plagiarism to include both the theft of or misappropriation of intellectual property and the substantial unattributed textual copying of another's work. The key word here is unattributed. It does not include authorship or credit disputes. Also, the theft or misappropriation of intellectual property includes the unauthorized use of ideas or unique methods obtained by a privileged communication, such as a grant application or a manuscript during review. So plagiarism is a global problem. It's a major problem in every country, but China seems to lead the world in plagiarism, at least in the research space. And there have been studies done on the incidence of plagiarism in the literature extant. And this is just one extract from Nature's publishing group, where in this journal, they found 31% incident of plagiarism in all papers published since 2008. And now this is not to very common to current days. This was only a 2-year period of review. And here, published only 2 years ago, almost exactly, here's an excerpt. China conducts first nationwide review of retractions and research misconduct. Universities must declare all their retractions and launch investigation into misconduct cases. A Nature analysis reveals that since 2021, there have been more than 17,000 retractions with Chinese co-authors. So this is a very serious problem. Plagiarism extends beyond the research enterprise. It occurs in almost every discipline. In politics, here's a extract from a Nature article where the Romanian prime minister was accused of plagiarism in his own PhD thesis. You probably remember, this is only about 10 years ago, that Melania Trump was accused of plagiarizing Michelle Obama's speech for her during their convention in the Republican National Convention. I'm going to go to this part. What about self-plagiarism? This is something that many people are not familiar with. Self-plagiarism is a problem not because it's an ethical violation per se, but because of copyright laws. So you can't copy substantial portions of text from your prior publications and use it in a subsequent publication without placing the text in quotes and without citing the original source. Similarly, you can't use the same figures, illustrations, tables, etc. in more than one publication unless you get prior permission from the copyright holder and duly credit the original source accordingly. This is very common in review articles. So the copyright holder may not be you, the original author. In fact, most publications, when they are accepted for publication by journals, you transfer the ownership, the copyright, to the publisher. So you have to go back to the copyright holder and get permission. Here is another excerpt from a Nature article talking about the incidence and increasing incidence of self-plagiarism. This has prompted funding agencies to crack down on these kinds of citations. Here's a case in the public media. Jonah Lehrers was a rising star in the literary field, and he was found to have plagiarized an article that he published in the New Yorker from another journal article. Authenticate, I talked about this a little bit in the first lecture. This is a tool that is commonly used for detecting redundant published text. So this is a computer platform that scans the world's literature extant and compares that against manuscripts that are submitted to journals. It can also be used, by the way, in the academic setting through the library services and in undergraduates and graduate level courses. So here is a Authenticate tool that has been expanded in recent years to detect self-plagiarism. And then this will show up in a printout in a report. Here's just a primer about what self-plagiarism is and how to avoid it. This is a publication that comes out freely from Authenticate. So I'm going to talk about this case. I mentioned this in the first lecture. This is a case, unfortunately, that I have firsthand knowledge of. This occurred in the mid-1980s. I was a postdoctoral fellow at Baylor College of Medicine at the Cullen Eye Institute in the early and mid-1980s, and Professor David Bridges was a world-renowned vision scientist known for his work on visual pigment biochemistry. And in this particular case, he was sent a manuscript to review from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, work from a competing laboratory, Paul Bernstein's thesis work under his professor, Robert Rando at Harvard University. Weeks later, he then wrote back to the PNAS and said that he had a conflict of interest and couldn't review the paper. But meanwhile, he took the method section from the Bernstein et al. Paper that was sent from the PNAS. He repeated the experiments verbatim, actually had his technician repeat it, and then sent his own manuscript to Science for publication, including verbatim extraction of the method section of the Bernstein et al. Paper. So it turned out that one of the reviewers of the Science manuscript that Dr. Bridges had submitted was Bob Rando, the senior author on the original paper that Bridges was sent to review. So Bob Rando called up the editor, the member of the National Academy of Sciences, John Dowling, who happened to be a professor in the biology department, not far from where Rando was also working, and brought these claims of plagiarism to his attention. And the NIH empaneled a group of distinguished scientists in the field to review the case. And they found that Dr. Bridges was indeed guilty of plagiarizing that manuscript, and he was debarred from federal funding and also any peer reviewer activities, that is, for reviewing grant applications, serving on study sections or private review panels, as well as reviewing manuscripts for any journal for 10 years. He was 58 years old at the time when this happened, so a 10-year debarment basically killed his scientific career. Here's another case that I thought was kind of interesting in the the annals of internal medicine. Here's a letter, Dear Plagiarist, a letter to a peer reviewer who stole and published our manuscript as his own. And then the editor of Annals published an editorial about this called Scientific Misconduct Hurts. And here is an excerpt from the author, Michael Danziger, who was at Tufts University, addressing the person who plagiarized his manuscript. Dear Doctor, I'm aware that you recently admitted to wrongly publishing as your own a scientific research paper that I had submitted to the Annals of Internal Medicine after serving as an external peer reviewer on our manuscript. You published that same manuscript in a different medical journal a few months later. You removed the names of the authors in the research site, replacing them with the names of your co-authors and your institution. So this is a very, very blatant case of plagiarism that was discovered through the peer review process. So what's wrong with plagiarism? It kind of is an intersection between moral principles and law. And so basically it is not only doing the wrong thing, but also places you in legal jeopardy for copyright infringement. Now, it turns out that this is such a prevalent problem that there are not just one, but multiple computer platforms that have been developed commercially. Authenticate, I've mentioned several times. This is the most commonly used tool for detecting plagiarism. Elsevier, which has over 1,400 life sciences journals, use this tool for all of its journals. I'm the editor-in-chief of one of their journals, and I use this tool every day because I receive anywhere between 6 and 12 manuscripts per day for that particular journal. And the very first thing that I do is look at the Authenticate report to see if there's evidence of plagiarism. Also in the academic setting, there's plagiarism.org, also Turnitin, which is a very commonly used tool here at UB, especially in the undergraduate academic setting. So what are the consequences of engaging in plagiarism? Well, you can be expelled. If you're a student here at UB, in any level, undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate, if you engage in plagiarism, it's possible, not that it's necessarily going to happen, but it is possible that you could be kicked out of the academic program. Okay, if you're a faculty member and you are found to have engaged in plagiarism or any other serious ethical violations, you will be reviewed, and it is possible that you could be fired from your job. Here in the University of Buffalo, here's an excerpt of the policies from the academic integrity site. University of Buffalo considers plagiarism a form of academic dishonesty and a serious breach of academic integrity. The penalties for plagiarism can be severe, including grade reduction of your student, course failure, student suspension, even student expulsion. University instructors are continuously developing more sophisticated methods of detecting plagiarism, including the use of detection software programs that I had just previously described. Examples of academic dishonesty, departmental procedures for penalizing students, and university policies related to plagiarism are available on the university's website, and I give you the academic integrity URL here. So, it is the policy of the University of Buffalo to maintain high ethical standards in research and other scholarly work, prevent misconduct where possible, and promptly and fairly evaluate and resolve any instance of alleged or apparent misconduct. And this applies to all faculty, students, fellows, and staff at UB who are engaged in any manner of scientific or scholarly inquiry. And the policy statement is shown on the right-hand side of the slide. So this is some years ago. I Googled how to avoid plagiarism, and in less than a half a second, I got 25 million hits. So this must be a very, very prevalent problem for that many citations to show up. So this is pretty simple, distilled group of suggestions. How to avoid plagiarism. Take clear, accurate notes where you found specific ideas. Write down the complete citation, the information from which you took each citation. Use quotation marks when directly stating another person's words. Remember, I said it's about unattributed use of text. Always credit original authors for their information and ideas. And this illustration that I have in the lower right-hand side, I did not create myself. I'm giving you the URL from which I extracted that image. Also, keep calm and say no to plagiarism is freely available on the internet. Okay, so here's some authorship ethics rules of thumb. Give credit where credit is due, and if you take credit, you must be willing to take responsibility. So there's a thing called a credit cycle. So let's say you engage in some research and you get some promising results. So you write those up for a peer-reviewed manuscript and you submit it for publication. And let's say that it makes it through the peer-reviewed process and it's published. Now this is your currency, basically, where you go to a funding source, such as a national study section or perhaps a foundation panel review, and you cite your published work as well as other people's published work in your grant application. And if you have citable work, that gives you some credibility to the study sections or the review panels, and you hopefully are able to obtain grant funding, where then you apply those funds to continue your research and then make more publications, etc. So this is a cycle. So there's three ways to give credit where credit is due. First is the author byline, and I'll talk about considerations about the number of authors and also the order of authors in a moment. Also, acknowledgments in a footnote, for instance. And third is the literature cited. The literature is very important because it provides precedents, attributions, scholarly context for evolution of concepts and hypotheses. Now let's talk about the designation of different kinds of authors. There's the senior author, the first author, sometimes the submitting author if he or she is not either of the first two, and then everybody else is a co-author, okay? And the role in the project will determine to some extent the position in the list of authors, okay? So a senior author is not necessarily the oldest person in the group of authors, but it's the person who decides on the list of co-authors and inclusion of acknowledgments. The person also reviews and is responsible to review all data, assumes overall responsibility for their validity, facilitates communication among co-authors, and also oversees the logistics of manuscript preparation and submission, and responses to reviewers' comments. That senior author is typically the last name in the author's string, typically. The first author is also called the principal author. That's the first name in the list of authors. And that person typically has to have three attributes: performs the experiments to garner the data that are used for the generation of the manuscript, interpret the results based on the collected data, and also typically at least writes the first draft of the manuscript. And often the senior author will edit that original draft, give other co-authors the opportunity to weigh in on editing, making suggestions for editing the manuscript to come up with a final product that is agreeable to everybody who is listed as a co-author. Okay, so this is one of the kind of gray zones and difficult problems in multi-author manuscripts. And I've come up with what I call the less is more rule. So what you would want to do is have the minimum number of authors who made significant contributions and qualified as an author, as opposed to having a huge number of people where you can't hardly tell who contributed to the work or in what way. So what's the order of the authors? You have to consider the implications relative to the role in the study and the contributions to the project. Who decides the order of authors? Well, that should be a group discussion, and you really should talk about this early on during the generation of the manuscript, and probably the buck stops at the senior author's discretion. And then there's a difference between authorship versus acknowledgement. So the fundamental principle of earned authorship has these components: participation, whether it's active versus passive, physical versus intellectual. There's conception and design of the project, analysis and interpretation of the data, drafting and revision of the manuscript, and then the final approval, typically the lab director, the senior author, if you're in graduate school, your thesis advisor, okay? You have to have these kinds of attributes. So what is a significant contribution? According to the ORI, it must have a major effect on the direction, scope, or depth of the research. It can include conceptualization, design, execution, and/or interpretation of the research. The development of necessary methodology and/or data analysis. And also, each person who is contributing something significant, they must be contributing to the clear understanding of the project's goals. Now, there are some things that don't constitute significant contributions, so therefore do not qualify persons for authorship. One is simply providing funding for the project. For example, if you're in a department chair and you have, let's say, discretionary funds, maybe from IFR or some other departmental source, simply providing funding for the conduct of a project does not constitute grounds for authorship. Mere status as the group leader, although typically the group leader will be a co-author because they have other broader responsibilities, but not necessarily. Also, providing space, instrumentation, and reagents do not qualify you for being a co-author. Performing routine technical work. So some people like to include their technicians on their manuscripts, but really they don't qualify under the ORI guidelines. They're being paid to do the technical work. They typically, not always, but typically they don't contribute to the intellectual development of the project. They don't interpret the data. They simply do their job and then they go home. They don't have to worry about what happens with those data after they are collected. Performing fee-for-service work. You're paying for something to be done. For instance, you pay for an antibody to be made or a custom synthesis of a specialized reagent. You're paying for that to be done. Whoever does that does not qualify as a co-author. Merely editing a manuscript. It's nice to give those people a acknowledgement, but doesn't qualify them as a co-author. So I want to revisit this providing mere status as the group leader. So I know of a personal case back when I was a postdoc many years ago, and a friend of mine in a different department came to me one day and he complained that he had written up this manuscript. He did all of the work, all of the data collection. He wrote the manuscript draft. He drew up all of the figures, and it was basically he and his preceptor, who was his postdoctoral advisor. And they sent this manuscript. This is back in the day when people used to hand write manuscripts before there was word processing, and he gave a pad of many pages of manuscript to a secretarial pool to type up the manuscript text. And what he got back was his manuscript, but with 4 other co-authors listed on the authorship byline, in addition to his name and his preceptors. And these people had absolutely nothing to do with the work. The reason why they were included, there was a division chief, there was a department chair, and another person who had an administrative function in the department. So those people did not qualify as co-authors, and yet it was the policy of that department to add those people on every paper that went out from their department. Also, another case which I know personally, this one at USC in the Department of Ophthalmology some years ago. A colleague of mine was a resident in that program. He did a research project, presented it at a national meeting, and when he went to put his poster together and get approval for the presentation, there were the names of the program director and the department chair on the abstract. And he balked at this, and he was told that if he wanted to complete the residency program, he would let these other people who did not contribute substantially to be co-authors. This is sort of under the same rubric of ransoming authorship. So here was an article in Science magazine many years ago. It is not uncommon for you to read a paper and see that the authors have perhaps generated a unique reagent, such as an antibody or some kind of other chemical compound that is necessary to perform a particular experimental protocol. And it's not uncommon to write to the authors of that paper and request, could you please have a small sample of that material to be able to do your own work. They are supposed to freely give those unique resources, especially if they were generated using federal grant funding resources. So they can't say that as a stipulation of giving you this reagent, that they must be a co-author on your papers, and you should not do that to anybody else either. So responsibilities of authorship. There's accountability as well as credit. You can't disavow responsibility for errors of content, whether or not honest mistake or outright deceit. The bottom line is, unless explicitly indicated, the responsibility or role in project, each author shares responsibility for the entire concept, the content of the manuscript. Also, when you submit a paper for publication, you sign a form that is a authorship assurances and declaration. This is all signed by all of the authors or by the communicating author, the person who's submitting that manuscript, on behalf of all of the co-authors. The stipulation is with full knowledge and consent of the others. Also, it gives assurances against copyright violations or property right of any third party, and gives assurances taking responsibility for the entirety of contents and conclusions of the manuscript. Also gives assurances against financial or any other conflicts of interest, just like I divulged that I lack any conflicts of interest at the very beginning of my lecture. So all of the publishing houses have this guide for authors, and this is from Elsevier. This is a general guide for author, but each of the specific journals might have their own specific variations on this. But one of the things that's included in the guide for authors is this verification of authorship and copyright. And it says, quote, authors are responsible for ensuring the integrity and quality of their reported research. Prior to publication, all authors are required to attest to this by signing a letter of submission. No manuscripts will be published without this consent. There's also this concept that I briefly alluded to in an example a few moments ago as honorary or gift authorship. This is assigning authorship to a person who had little or nothing to do with the project or manuscript derived therefrom. And there are several cases that have appeared in the literature where people who had nothing to do with the work were listed as co-authors, but problems occurred, ethical violations were discovered, and then they were found guilty along with the people who actually engaged in the scientific misconduct, along with everybody else. The flip side of honorary authorship is author exclusion. This is the failure to include a person as co-author when that person had substantively contributed to a study or project. In other words, that they qualified for earned authorship. Excluding someone who qualifies as a co-author from reviewing primary data, drafts of manuscripts that have utilized that person's intellectual property, ideas and concepts, data, for the purpose of preventing them from having knowledge about the intended submission of a manuscript. This is comparable to theft. It robs the individual of due credit. So the bottom line is all persons designated as authors should qualify for authorship. The order of authorship should be a joint decision of all co-authors. Participation must be sufficient to take public responsibility for the content of the manuscript. And under the ICMJE authorship qualifications guidelines, these three conditions must be met: conception and design, or analysis and interpretation of the data, drafting the article or revising the article critically for important intellectual content, and final approval of the draft to be submitted. All persons designated as authors should qualify for authorship, and all those who qualify should be listed. Now, there is something that has arisen in the last 10 to 15 years called explicit disclosure. You will typically see this at the end of manuscripts where the author contributions are specifically delineated. So in this editorial that appeared in Science in 2010, Dr. Alberts, who was then the editor-in-chief, introduced a new rule for science contributors. The editorial announced that in order to combat honorary authorship, contributors to science as well as to Nature and PNAS who shared in the development of these principles would have to describe their contributions to the article prior to acceptance. This is similar to the policies that Drummond Rennie promoted at the JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, except that science, the information is kept on file, but not routinely published, but actually subsequently almost all publications do in fact publish these contributions at the end of the manuscripts. Furthermore, to improve accountability, a senior author from each laboratory or group participating in the collaboration must now certify that he or she has reviewed the original data and its representation. Then that is about authorship inclusion. But people who don't qualify as co-authors but did something significant to contribute to the work, they should get an acknowledgement. And so here stipulated, all contributors who do not meet the criteria for authorship should be listed in an acknowledgement section. Examples of those who might be acknowledged include a person who provided purely technical help, writing assistance, or a department chair who provided only general support or maybe financial support. Editors should ask authors to disclose whether they had writing assistance and to identify the entity that paid for this assistance. Financial and material support should also be acknowledged. This part about the paid assistance for writing, this is very common now, especially for authors for whom English is a second language or is not their primary language. It is very common to seek professional editing help, and it's a fee-for-service arrangement to help polish the English language utilized in the generation of text. And I will get into the use of AI, allowable and not, in a moment. So that third way of giving credit where credit is due is citing the literature. This gives historical precedent to the work. It should be sufficient to provide adequate intellectual context for your work. It should not purposely exclude contributions of others, for instance, your competitors or your perceived competitors, and should be cited in the style and format of the journal to which your manuscript has been submitted for publication. So, for instance, today I handled a manuscript that violated the guide for authors with regard to the citation format and style that we use in the journal for which I serve as the editor-in-chief. Some journals use a numerical citation style. We use alphabetical by the last name of the first author, etc. So it's important to comply with the guide for author for the journal to which you're submitting your manuscripts. Okay, so there's, in addition to the ICMJE, there's a Council of Science Editors, or the CSE, and they published a white paper promoting integrity in scientific journal publications. And I just want to talk about briefly an instance about deceased authors. So this may happen during the submission process or after the submission process, where one of the co-authors dies. And then what do you do about that? Okay, so according to the CSA white paper, for cases in which a co-author dies or is incapacitating during the writing, submission, or peer-reviewed process, co-authors should obtain disclosure and copyright documentation from a familial or legal proxy. So I'm going to talk to you about a case with which I have firsthand personal knowledge. So here are several citations of published work emanating from the laboratory of George Schroepfer, who was a professor and chair of biochemistry at Rice University many years ago. And all of these papers are published from 2000 and later. The problem is that Dr. Schroepfer died in 1998. So it's highly unlikely that he designed the experiments described in these publications. He certainly wasn't around to collect or review the data. He could not possibly have written or approved the submitted manuscripts. And how do I know this personally? Because he was my PhD advisor, and I knew him very well personally. So these publications, I understand why the co-authors who were actual qualified co-authors cited Dr. Schroepfer, but there's an appropriate way to do that that is not necessarily list them in the byline. So here's another ethical violation called duplicate publishing. So there is the less egregious version is duplicate submission, where you submit the exact same manuscript to 2 or more journals simultaneously for consideration of publication. And more egregious is if 2 or more of those manuscripts are actually accepted by different journals and they actually come out in print or online. So duplicate publication of essentially the same data constitutes a violation of copyright law and the ethics of scientific publishing. Do not submit the same manuscripts simultaneously in more than one journal. Just today, I handled one of up to at least 4 cases this year, more than a dozen cases last year that I handled of duplicate submission, where the author submitted the exact same manuscript to 2 different journals simultaneously. This is an ethical violation. So here is extracted from BBA Biomembranes, guides for authors. Submission of a manuscript implies that the work described has not been published before, except in the form of an abstract or as part of a published lecture or academic theses, and it is not under consideration for publication elsewhere. The publication has been approved by all of the authors and tacitly or explicitly by the responsible authorities in the laboratories where the work was carried out, and that if accepted, it will not be published elsewhere in the same form, in either the same or another language, without the consent of the editors and the publisher, typically the copyright holders. Reference should be made to the previously published abstracts in the introductory section. Responsibility for the accuracy of the material in the manuscript, including bibliographic citations, lies entirely with the authors. So now I'm going to turn to something that has obviously come up in recent years. It's the use of artificial intelligence, also known as generative AI. So the monster in the room, the advent of remarkable growth and misuse of AI technology has been a significant contributor to ethical breaches in the publishing world. Combination of computer-driven databases searches harvest and manipulate existing data to repurpose or so-called create data out of thin air, as well as to steal published text and recombine them in ways that may seem original to the unsuspecting reader. And there are many articles that have been published in the last 2 to 3 years on this. These are just 2, as I've cited below. So ChatGPT is by far the most common tool. This was developed by a company started by Sam Altman. is now a multi-millionaire. ChatGPT is a natural language processing tool driven by AI technology that allows you to have human-like conversations, much more with a chatbot. The language model can answer questions and assist you with tasks such as composing emails, essays, even code. Ethically, there's a concern about the potential misuse of this model, such as in the creation of a deepfake audio or text, or in spreading false or misleading information. There's also concern about unintended bias in the training data, which could lead to model perpetuating harmful stereotypes or discrimination. This new technology presents an evolving set of ethical issues that remain to be resolved. This often comes up in plagiarized work that is in term papers, for instance, at the undergraduate level, but also more frequently now in the postgraduate world, in presentations, public presentations, at conferences and the like, and also in publications. Here's an extract off of a Google Scholar. AI-generated research is a threat both in terms of society's knowledge and public trust in science. This was the conclusion made by the researchers from the Swedish School Library and Information Science, University of Borås, Sweden, that recently identified 100 suspected AI-generated articles in the Google Scholar search engine. So there are so many ethical issues that have been raised just in the use of ChatGPT. There's just now hundreds of articles that have been published in the biomedical literature in just the last few years. So now most journals now have policies regarding generative AI. Elsevier has a broad-based policy about the use and restrictions on use of AI in scientific writing. That's by the authors, but also applies to reviewers when they're writing their own reviews of manuscripts, and also to editors who are engaging in the review process, peer review. UB doesn't have a far-reaching policy yet on the use of artificial intelligence. This is off of the website of the Office of Academic Integrity. There's a lot of discretion that is given to the course directors and instructors about what they will or will not allow as use of generative AI in their specific courses. But if you go to publish work, the publishers will have explicit guidelines and restrictions on the use of AI. Now, it turns out, just like there were tools that were developed for detecting plagiarism, now there are tools that have been developed to detect the use of AI. And here is just a few of them that I was able to find. Some of these are better than others, but the very fact that there are multiple platforms for detecting AI usage would suggest to you that this is a significant problem. Okay, so I'm going to give you some closing thoughts here. The value of one's contributions to science is judged more on the impact than on the number of one's publications, and it's better to succeed because of one's reputation than in spite of it. And at this point, we will pause and take any questions if anybody has any, and Liz will be monitoring this and addressing this. Is anybody who have questions for me at this juncture?
We do have one question in the chat.
Okay.
It says, how do journals or editors keep track or find out that the same manuscript has been submitted to another journal?
That's a great question. So the example today, the journals have an entire ethics team that will scan and review every manuscript that is submitted, and these jobs are turfed. There's not just one or two people. There's an entire division of Elsevier that is dedicated just to these kinds of issues. And maybe for next time I give this lecture, I will actually extract the email that I received today that alerted me to a manuscript that I received today for consideration was simultaneously submitted to another Elsevier journal. Then I had to write to the authors to say that this was detected, that we were rejecting their manuscript because of an ethical breach. Also, I have language that says that their department chair or their dean or research integrity officer at their institution may be informed about this breach, and also that the editor-in-chief, my counterpart to the editor, the journal that was the other journal to which the same manuscript was submitted, I was going to be writing to that person, which I did, to inform them of my action and urging them to also reject the manuscript from their journal as well. So a very good question and very practical, and literally today I had to do this. Other questions?
There's no more in the chat.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to go on to the cases. So just like last time, I'm going to read the particulars of the case, and then there will be questions. And this, at that juncture, I will be asking people to voluntarily step up and answer the questions. Okay. So case one, Mary is a technician in the lab of Dr. Kuhl. She tends to work during the regular Monday through Friday work week, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., and assists graduate students and postdocs in Dr. Kuhl's lab with their projects, as well as doing experimental work specifically assigned to her by Dr. Kuhl. Mostly her work consists of running polyacrylamide gels and Western blots and PCR. Over a conversation at lunch one day, Mary learned that the lab had recently published a blockbuster paper in Nature Genetics, which included work that she had done in the lab. However, her name was not listed as a co-author of the paper. Mary then confronted Dr. Kuhl about not being included as a co-author on the paper, saying that her work represented a significant contribution. Dr. Kuhl agreed that Mary had contributed substantively to the project and explained that he specifically gave her credit in the acknowledgement section of the paper for technical assistance. To do otherwise, he said, would violate ICMJE guidelines, which would be uncool. All right, so the questions come up. You were given the particular about Mary's role, okay? Does Mary have a legitimate case? Should she have been included as a co-author on the paper? Why or why not? Would somebody like to give their answer, their thoughts? Anybody?
Hi, this is Lisette. No, I don't think she has a legitimate case. She's a technician being paid to complete these tasks. I can understand why she feels that maybe she should have gotten, or have been listed as a co-author, but she was listed in the acknowledgement section.
Thank you, Lisette. Do others agree with this, or does anybody have a dissenting opinion? Hearing nothing, I will say that Lisette exactly answered this correctly. Mary was given credit where credit was due per ICMJE guidelines. Okay, she has a routine paid for service job. There's no indication that she contributed to the intellectual development of the project, interpretation of the data, writing the manuscript. So she did not qualify as a co-author. Okay, and if not, under what circumstances would it have been appropriate to include Mary as a co-author on the paper?
We have a hand raised, Noah.
Sorry, my connection might be a little spotty, but I think if she like you said, contributed to like sort of the what's it called, like contextualization of the project. And if she contributed to the manuscript itself, she would have had a legit.
Right. So very good, Noah. Remember, I listed those three things that qualifies you as a co-author. All three have to be done. And so it's the conceptualization, collection of data, analysis of data, contributing to the writing of the paper, the final approval of the paper. All of those things would have qualified her if she had done those things. Okay, this should make you a little more uncomfortable. What if Mary had been a graduate student or postdoc in the lab? So now we're telling you she's not a technician anymore. She's a graduate student or a postdoc. Would that change your answer? Why or why not?
I can try here. So I think it's really about the function, the activity, and not the position. So if we just look strictly at what was done, in this case, she wouldn't be attributed the authorship position because of her title. It's really what was done. So even if you flipped it and she became like a grad student, it still boils down to what was done, what was the contribution. So if we just keep our eyes on the contribution and not the contributor's position, then I think it would be easy to just know that it wouldn't change. The contribution is what we're looking at.
I think that you gave a very well-reasoned and well-articulated answer. It's not the position of the person, it is what the specific contributions is, okay? And I put this in there because I know personally of cases where principal investigators have utilized graduate students and postdocs as if they are technicians only. In other words, have not included them in the intellectual development of the project, or engaged them in the writing of the paper, or even shared with them a manuscript draft to include them in the process. This is not a good practice. Graduate students are supposed to be intellectually challenged and develop intellectually, and they're supposed to be actively engaged in the development of the project in all of its aspects. So you gave a very good answer, I believe. And it says, the last question is, do you know of instances where technicians have been given co-author status on papers? If so, explain the circumstances. Is there anybody on the call who knows of such cases? Elizabeth?
Yes, I do. It happened to me, actually. It was many, many years ago when I was a young thing out of college before graduate school, and I worked for a doctor. I was his only technical support, and he was pretty much the only one doing he was essentially the PI, and there weren't other people associated with it, or not directly. And he gave me co-authorship, and I mean, I was happy at the time and certainly cited it in later years, but this was before any of these rules were in place. I mean, I think I'm thinking that there were other people on the paper, and I'm guessing one of them was the department chair, and we know now that that isn't a legit way to do things, and I'm very much in support of all of this, but that's my story.
Thank you for sharing that. And I have to say that in the 1960s through the 1980s, or even into the 1990s, it was not uncommon that technicians would be cited because of the work that they did, but this was well before the ICMGE guidelines had been established. I had a technician before I came here who was incredibly talented technically, but also read the literature, helped in the design of experiments, helped in analysis of data, created figures for the papers that we published, and I included him as a co-author because he qualified as a co-author. Okay, so I've seen it go both ways, right? I think we'll go on to the next case. So Dr. Jung is a junior faculty member in the Department of Big Data Science, which is chaired by Dr. IMA Slimebucket. She has just finished writing up a manuscript describing the work her lab has been doing for the past 3 years and is thinking of submitting it to Science. She sends a draft of her manuscript to her department chair for his comments and suggestions. A week later, Dr. Jung receives her manuscript back from Dr. Slimebucket with some minor edits and a few sidebar queries in the margins. She also notices that Dr. Slimebucket has inserted his name on the author line. Dr. Jung thanks Dr. Slimebucket for making suggested edits, but questions including him as a co-author. Dr. Slimebucket insists that his edits were substantive and that including him as a co-author would add gravitas to the paper, given his eminent standing in the field. He also reminds Dr. Jung that her promotion and tenure rely on his goodwill and endorsement of her. Hopefully you're feeling very uncomfortable at this point. By the way, this is a fabricated case, but it's based on real life, a situation of which I personally know. Okay, so should Dr. Slimebucket be included as a co-author on Dr. Jung's paper? Why or why not? Somebody speak to this, please. Zachary?
He only provided a role in the writing of the manuscript because he lacks any involvement in the design or data collection. He should not be listed as a co-author, no matter his role in the university department.
If you had to label this as something, which I described in some detail in this lecture, what would you call this when adding Dr. Slimebucket as a co-author who didn't qualify?
This would be essentially based on his assertions at the end, essentially ransoming his authorship. I can't remember if that was the word you used, but
so this would be gift or honorary authorship, right?
Right.
Right. Okay. Hopefully everybody understands that. So if his name was included as a co-author, what aspect of ICMG guidelines would this illustrate? Basically, I just answered that. I'm sorry. If he's not included as a co-author, is there some other way that his so-called contributions might be more suitably acknowledged? How would you do that? Somebody else, please answer. Arissa?
I think you could easily put him in the acknowledgments as an editor of the paper.
Sure. You can say, thanks to Dr. Slimebucket for useful discussions or something like that in the acknowledgement section. I think that could be appropriate. Okay. All right. So let's move on, and this should make you even more uncomfortable. If he insists on being included as a co-author, what recourse does Dr. Jung have? Think of you, if you were in this position, what could you do? Okay, So we are given the information that this is a department chair. Basically, Dr. Jung could press the case with Dr. Slimebucket. It seems like she's already approached him about this, but if she is not getting any satisfaction and doesn't believe that Dr. Slimebucket should be a co-author, she should go to Dr. Slimebucket's boss. And Dr. Slimebucket's boss would be the dean of that school, and ask for a meeting and have the meeting with Dr. Slimebucket and say, here's the particulars of this case, and I don't think that he qualifies for co-authorship. Again, this case was intended to make you feel uncomfortable for you putting yourself in the position of Dr. Jung, of how you would deal with this case. And so the last part is, other than an issue of authorship ethics, are there any other aspects that you find of concern with this scenario? Look at the last few lines. Yes, Jordan.
Towards the end, he's sort of weaponizing his reputation and career and his position over Dr. Young. So that sort of like abuse, where he's saying that, oh, because I've been here longer and more experienced, you should probably heed my advice, which is very unethical.
It's even more than that, because he's also let her know that he's in the position to either endorse or block her academic promotion and her career. There's one word that describes that: coercion. And it is absolutely unethical and is not tolerated at this university or any other. So this scenario is a fabricated scenario with the names, but I personally know of a case like this that occurred in another university, fortunately not here. Okay, so think about this. You might find yourself in this position down the line. The last case, Dr. Vishnu Verheer is a member of the NIH study section panel and has been assigned several grant applications for review. One of the applications concerns studies that are directly relevant to the work Dr. Verheer is doing in his own lab, using a brand new and unpublished technique developed by the PI whose application Dr. Verheer is reviewing. Dr. Verheer recognizes the value of this new method and that it would greatly enhance and speed up the work in his own lab. So he provides the details of the new method to a technician in his lab and instructs her to carry out some new experiments using it. The experiments provide spectacular results. Dr. Verheer then writes up and submits a manuscript describing the results and submits it to Cell, one of the highest profile journals in the biomedical field. He also writes and submits a new grant application based largely upon that work, specifically directing it to a different study section than the one on which he had recently served. Okay. Questions. Did Dr. Verheer commit scientific misconduct? Why or why not? If so, under what part of the ORI definition of scientific misconduct does this fall? This should be easy for you. Somebody please answer this question. Anybody?
He did commit scientific misconduct, and I think it would be plagiarism. He basically took someone else's information, methods, and applied it to his own research.
Blatant plagiarism. Yes. So it's not unlike the case of David Bridges, where he stole the work of somebody who submitted a manuscript and he was reviewing the manuscript. The same applies if you're reviewing a grant application. It's a privileged communication. Okay. You're not allowed to use that information for personal gain. Okay. If Dr. Verheer, and thank you very much for answering that correctly, if Dr. Verheer's submitted manuscript was rejected, so it was not published, or his grant application was unsuccessful, so not funded, would this change your answer? Why or why not? Lizette, do you want to just follow up on that?
Yes, sure. Yeah, I would still feel that he committed scientific misconduct. It wouldn't change my answer.
Right. He's still engaged in that unethical conduct, right? It doesn't matter the outcome. It's engaging in that conduct is misconduct. Yes. Just like, remember I talked about the fact you falsify data or fabricate data and you put it into a lab notebook and never sees the light of day. You've still engaged in scientific misconduct by ORA's definition. All right, this gets even more weird. Is Dr. Verheer's lab tech guilty of scientific misconduct? Remember, Dr. Verheer gave this methodology to the lab tech to carry out the experiments, which proved to work out really well. Is the lab tech guilty of scientific misconduct? Why or why not?
I think the lab technician is not guilty for misconduct because she's simply following instruction and doing what the lab director tell her to do. So I don't think she's guilty for that.
And that's exactly correct. And remember, under the ORI definition, it has to be done knowingly or recklessly, right? So the technician had absolutely no knowledge that these were not Dr. Verheer's ideas. This is the exact same real-life case that occurred in Dr. David Bridges' laboratory, where he gave the methods section of a privileged communication to his unsuspecting technician who carried out the experiments. They worked exactly as the manuscript described, had no knowledge that this was stolen from somebody else. The NIH panel found that he was not guilty of scientific misconduct, but Dr. Bridges definitely was. Okay. Okay, and lastly, why do you think Dr. Verheer directed his grant application to an alternative study section? Do you think he can plausibly invoke what I call the Costanza defense? Like he didn't know that that was wrong? Why do you think he sent it to a different study section?
I think he knows it's wrong.
Okay.
Because it would be recognized if it went to the same study section, he would be caught.
Exactly correct. So you're sitting around the table with, a couple dozen people, of which maybe 2 to 3, possibly 4 other people have read this same grant application. So they are going to get a sense of deja vu that, oh, I've seen this before. Oh, I've seen this in somebody else's grant application. And guess what? Dr. Verheer was the primary reviewer on that grant application. So that's why he sent it to a different study section to ensure that nobody with prior knowledge would recognize that this was stolen work. Okay. Well,
I have a question.
Go ahead.
In the case of your question above that, what if the lab tech somehow suspects there's something fishy going on? That's
so. What
possible.
Do you think? I'll turn it back.
Well, I think they're then guilty, but they're in a pickle, just like Dr. Jung was in the previous example, because it's kind of, if you say anything to your boss, in this case, maybe worse, it's kind of a career-ending move there in the lab, right?
So if it's only a suspicion, it's not knowingly, right?
Yes.
So but it would be incumbent for the person to say, where did you come up with this? This is really interesting. Or did you create this? And then If Dr. Verheer lied to her and said, "Oh yes, these are my words," then she would have no basis to actually knowing that it was plagiarized material. But if he said, "Well, I got this as I got this from a grant application that I recently reviewed," now it becomes much more difficult. Okay, in which case now you have to go against your PI and maybe bring this to your department chair or maybe the dean to say, "I'm really uncomfortable with this and I don't want to be engaged in this activity."
Right.
But thank you for bringing that up. So,
well, it would seem that the technician might suspect it, but actually have no real way of verifying it because it was part of a peer-reviewed thing at a study section, which the technician wouldn't have access to, right?
Right. So again, they could suspect something, but if they don't have actual knowledge, they're not doing something knowingly that violates fundamental research principles. So I think that that's all I have for you today. Are there other questions? There is a hand raise. Dr. Ochi?
Sonia Chen. So the question that Elizabeth asked was what I was kind of ruminating on. And the way I was thinking, so if the technician suspected, asked questions, verified, and was told to shut up and do it, and her job was at stake, or his job, whoever, their job was at stake, and they had to do it because, the situation was tight, they have a family to feed, not excusing that behavior, but they did it because they just, go into reports and all of the backlash and everything that would happen. And this person was probably very influential. How do you strike that balance between they knew and they didn't know, or they just had to go on with it? Like, this is where it's I don't know, do they ever have situations like this where when the case comes out to the open and everything is, just established that this was the trend and this was what happened, that the technician can actually be excused?
It's a difficult case, and I don't have a black and white answer for you for this particular case. It's a very difficult situation. There was another hand raised. Would somebody else like to speak up? All right, seeing none. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Liz, would you like to make a closeout announcement about the survey?
Sure. I put the link to the survey in the chat, so if everyone could please complete that. And next week is our next workshop. It's on next Wednesday, March 4th, on conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment with Dr. Sri Ganesh Ramasandra Rao.
Very good. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you especially for the people who engaged in the Q&A. And I want to again thank Liz very much for helping to facilitate these two lectures that I gave and also going forward for the rest of the workshop. Thank you very, very much. And everybody have a good evening.